Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
Welcome into the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network 2024 Team Autopsy Report. As we continue to move our way through the Southeastern Conference, folks, we're going to take a trip down to Gainesville, Florida, because a lot of things to unpack with this team, and I don't have a lot of time to do it. So let's start with the head coach, Billy Napier. Coach Napier, interesting tenure, we'll call it. In his 4 years as the head coach of Louisiana, 40 wins, 12 losses, a win percentage of 77%. Now, in his 3 years as the head coach of the University of Florida, 19 wins, 19 losses. Interesting to note, he is the first Florida Gator head coach to have 19 or more losses within his first 3 years and actually get a fourth year. I think that has a lot to do with not wanting to see that quarterback, DJ Lackley, transfer. So we'll get to that talented young quarterback here in just a moment. But I want to just say, if you're just now joining us on YouTube or on our Twitter handle at CrunchTimeVIP, I want to say welcome aboard. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, thank you for joining us as well. First time or returning back, we always appreciate it. Now, let's start with the season win total. And going into the preseason, the Florida Gators were expected to have the most toughest schedule that any handicapper has seen, at least in the last decade. That turned out to not be quite the case given some of the records that their opponents had. We'll talk about that in a moment. But that season win total for the Florida Gators was set at 4.5. We know the Gators getting to 7 wins last year absolutely exceeded that. When we look at our in-season composite win total, 3 unique statistical categories make up that number. We actually had the Gators at a 7.2. So we kind of had a better feel once we got in season of what this team would look like versus that season win total there. Now, let's talk about that strength of schedule and strength of record. The Gators absolutely played a difficult strength of schedule, no question about it. 0.624, third toughest in all of Division I football, 134 teams last year. But now when we look at their strength of record, basically kind of think of it like your opponent's winning percentage. How did your opponents do during their season? 0.591. That was 27th out of 134 teams. So when I get to that part of the data, you're going to see some teams that we thought would be a lot better. Turned out they really weren't. So let's go ahead and pull that up. If you're watching again on YouTube, thank you. I'm going to have our podcast listeners covered with all of this data. So I mentioned a team that had a strength of record of 27. Let's take a look at some of their opponents' records and see how did we get from the third toughest strength of schedule to only the 27th strength of record. The Hurricanes finished 10-2. We disregard FCS Sanford. They're out of the Metro Birmingham area as an FCS team. Texas A&M was 8-4. Mississippi State 2-10. UCF 4-8. Tennessee 10-2. Kentucky 4-8. Georgia 10-2. Texas 11-1. LSU 8-4. Ole Miss 9-3. But then you ended the year with the Seminoles at 2-10. So we thought that the Kentucky team going into the preseason would be better. Many had higher expectations for A&M and certainly for Florida State. So, like I said, their power rankings high, just not that opponent win record nearly as high as was forecasted. Now, let's take a look at how good were the defenses that this Florida Gator offense faced last year. We'll use a baseline of 68. And the reason for that is there were 68 Power 4 teams last year. When you look at the 4 major conferences and Notre Dame, that's how we use that baseline of 68. So the Hurricanes were 47th. The Aggies of Texas A&M were 30th. UCF was 61st. The Tennessee Volunteers were 3rd. Kentucky was 13th in defense. Georgia was 5th. The Longhorns of Texas were 2nd. LSU was 29th. Ole Miss was 4th. And then finally, Florida State was 51st. So basically outside of their FCS opponent and Mississippi State, 10 of their 12 opponents were inside of that top 68. You're talking about a defense that would have been power ranked when we averaged those 11 games, 32nd. You're talking about a team that would have been at least worst case scenario 10-2 with this kind of defense. Could have been an 11-1 defense, but like I said, worst case scenario, they're 10-2. So that's the kind of caliber of defenses that this Florida Gator team went up against week in and week out. So they faced a serious subset of defenses there. Now, I'm going to give you 3 data points as we start to dig into this offense a little bit. The NCAA average will be the first number I give you. The second will be the Florida Gators regular season total in that category. And then finally, we're going to give you our adjusted number for that category based on the opponents that the Gators played last year. So let's start with the points per game. Average team last year scored about 28 points per game. The Gators 27.9. So basically right on the NCAA average. But when we adjust for opponent, goes up to 32.3 points per game, so about a 4-point improvement there. The average passing offense last year for a team was about 227 yards. The Gators, whether it is their accounting stats or our adjusted passing number, 219 yards per game. So a little bit below the average team last year in college football. The run game. Now here's where we're going to see a big difference here. Average team last year, about 160 yards per game. The Gators on the surface, 156 yards per game. But when we adjust that for opponent, that number goes up to 190 yards per game. So about a 34 yard per game improvement there by their run game if we're looking at it adjusted for opponent. And then total offense. The average team last year, about 387 yards per game of total offense. The Gators, 375. Then again, like I said, when we adjust for opponent, that number now goes to 409 yards per game. So this offense was even better than what their accounting stats say they were, about 34 yards per game better as far as a total offense standpoint. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into the numbers here. The average team last year, drives ending with either a touchdown or field goal, about 40% of the time. The Gators were at 46.4 when we adjust that for opponent. As far as drives ending with a touchdown, average team last year was about 29% of their drives ending with a touchdown. The Gators were at 37%, so also an improvement there. And then when we look at third down conversion, average team converted about 39% last year. The Gators were at 42. So you're asking yourselves probably the same question I'm asking myself. How did this team only finish 7-5 with this kind of offensive output and production when we adjust for opponent? They also did a great job in sacks, only allowed 19 sacks. Here's where we find our first pressure point. 17 committed turnovers. That's a little bit high. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's go next level with these numbers. We call it our 3 E's. How effective, how explosive, and how efficient was your offense last year? And for the Gators, 49th effectiveness in offense, 33rd in explosiveness, and then 42nd in efficiency. The Florida Gators in 2024 ended the regular season as our 42nd rated offense in college football. Not bad. So if I had to bullet point their offense, I would say flashes of explosiveness, but lack consistency throughout the season. And if we look at some of the games that they lost, we'll see some of that start to bear out. Inconsistency scoring points. Only 20 points against Texas A&M. Only 17 points in the opener against Miami. 17 points against Tennessee in a game that was there for the taking for them to win. All right, let's get to the quarterback, DJ Lackway. We're not even going to wait to the end of the podcast to get to it. So DJ Lackway, the talented freshman quarterback that took over full-time starter in the final 3 games against LSU, Ole Miss, and the regular season finale against Florida State. So 2 really good defense and 1 defense that was absolutely not really motivated once we got towards the end of the season. So on the season, let's take a look at DJ Lackway's numbers. 12 games, completed 60% of his passes. That's not good, first of all. 1,915 yards passing, 12 touchdowns, 9 INTs. Now, Lackway's yards per game, 160 yards. Now, we know that that's slanted because not all the games did he truly play in. So let's take a look at the games where down the stretch where he was the starter. So 2 of those games at home against LSU and Ole Miss, and then the road game to Florida State. Let's take a look at his numbers in those 3 contests. 37 completions, 65 attempts, a completion percentage even worse than his average. He completed 57% of his passes, threw for 539 yards of total yardage there, 5 passing touchdowns, 2 INTs. So when we divide that up and look at it in that 3-game stretch, DJ Lagway averaged about 180 yards per game passing. Folks, if the Gators have any hopes of improving this number and saving Billy Napier's job, Lagway is going to have to become a much, much better passer than what he was in those 3 contests. Now, let's take a look at the defense here. How good was the offenses that Florida defense had to face week in and week out? And once again, we'll use that baseline of 68. So the Miami Hurricanes was the number 1 offense for us in college football last year. Texas A&M was 22nd. Mississippi State was 39th. UCF, their offense was 24th. Tennessee's was 26th. Georgia was 12th. Texas was 6th. LSU was 21st. And then finally, Ole Miss was 5th. Once again, if we average those out, you got 9 opponents there out of your 12 that was inside of that 68. Talking about an average there of 32. Once again, you're looking at a opponent's offense week in and week out that would have been probably 10-2 as well. Because you're looking at a team that would have been barely outside of the top 25 if you just look at that average per week. So basically, you're facing a top 30 team every single week during the season. Your defense is absolutely getting challenged as well week in and week out. Welcome to the Southeastern Conference, Billy Napier. Okay, now for the defense, as I dive into those numbers, I'm just going to give you the raw accounting stats and then the adjusted number that we have for the Gators. Points per game allowed, 24.3. We adjust for opponent, goes down a full touchdown to 17.1. Their passing yards per game allowed, 236 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, folks, this pass defense was elite, 186 yards per game. That is a full half of a football difference when we adjust for opponents. So much better job there for the Florida Gators, even than what their numbers show. Their rushing defense, 156.2 yards per game allowed. When we adjust for opponent, that goes up just a tad to 161. So about a 5-yard differential there. And as far as their total offense allowed per game, 392 yards per game. Once again, when we adjust that for opponent, it goes down to about 347 yards per game. So still a 46-yard per game improvement is what this Florida Gator team would have been when we adjust that for opponent. Now, once again, let's dive deep into the numbers here. Opponent's drive ending with a score. Only 26.6% of the Florida Gators' opponent's drive ended with either a field goal or a touchdown. That is phenomenal. When you look at their opponent's drive ending with a touchdown, also phenomenal. Only 16.6% of their opponent's drive ended with a touchdown. A 12 percentage point improvement over the average team in college football last year. And then their opponents converting on third downs, only 33.9%. So again, much improved over the average team last year. The Gators did a great job of getting after the opponent's quarterback. 35 sacks in the games that we tracked. Did a decent job of not allowing their opponents to convert on fourth downs. 25 attempts that this Gator defense faced, 14 conversions. So that's about not too much worse than what the average team was last year. Average team was about 53%, the Gators at 56, so about a 3 percentage point differential there. Forced 22 turnovers. So remember I said that their offense committed quite a few turnovers. The defense was actually doing a decent job of trying to get the ball back for the Gators last year. Now let's talk about their defensive 3 E's. This team was the 57th rated effective defense last year, 45th in explosiveness allowed, and then 26th in efficiency allowed. The Florida Gators ended the regular season as the 42nd rated defense. So their offensive rating and their defensive rating was absolutely the same. That tells me a lot of inconsistencies there. So if I had to sum up this defense, I would say struggle a little bit in the passing game based on their raw counting numbers. But when we adjusted out, they looked a little bit better than what those numbers looked like. Now, let's get into the coaching situation and situational play here. And then we'll touch on the special teams before we go to the split. When I look at the Gators last year, they were, make sure I have this correct here. Okay, I have the Gators at 1-1 in one-score games. And then against quality opponents, four wins and 5 losses. Yeah, that's tough there. And Billy Napier is one of the least aggressive head coaches going for it on 4th down last year. Out of 144 qualifying head coaches, he was 135th. Only went for it on 4th down 7.1% of the time. And given his team's performance as far as that goes, makes absolute sense to me. A team that converted only 5 out of 11 conversion attempts, 45% on 4th downs. That makes a ton of sense, Billy Napier, on why your team was not a little bit more aggressive going forward on 4th down. Now, let's take a look at their splits here for their offense. How did this team look in the games that they won versus how did they look when they lost? So in their 7 wins in the regular season, this team was averaging 34.9 points per game. So basically 35 points per game and doing that with about 256 yards per game passing on just 24 attempts. So 10.8 yards per attempt, 15.8 yards per completion. That's telling me you racked up a lot of big yardage through the air against some really bad teams last year. The run game in their 7 wins, 35 rushing attempts, 176 yards per game rushing, 5.0 yards per rushing attempt there. 432 yards per game in total offense, 7.4 yards per play. The run pass ratio was absolutely phenomenal. 60% run, 40% pass. This team was converting on 3rd downs at a 47% clip and committed just 5 turnovers in those 7 wins. So we know the numbers are going to absolutely look topsy-turvy when we look at those 5 losses. Only 18.2 points per game. 168 yards per game, passing on 28 attempts. The yards per attempt basically cut in half down to 5.9 yards per attempt, 11.5 yards per completion. The rushing attempts basically stay the same, about 34 rush attempts per game, but the yardage goes down significantly. 128 yards per game in those 3 losses, 3.7 yards per rushing attempt. Total offense goes down to 196. So you're talking about a difference of 136 yards per game in total offense, about 48 yards less in the run game, and almost 88 yards per game less from the pass game. When we look at their run pass ratio in those 5 losses, 55% run to 45% pass, only 27% on third downs, 40% on fourth downs, committed 12 turnovers. Let's take a look at the defensive splits here. In their 5 wins, this defense, as you would expect, looked phenomenal. 16 points per game. Their opponents only 206 yards per game passing on 34 attempts, 6 yards per pass attempt, 10.8 yards per completion. Their opponents, 41 rushing attempts per game when they won, but just 132 yards per game rushing, 3.2 yards per rushing attempt, about 337 yards per game in total offense allowed, 4.5 yards per play. That's pretty special there. Their opponents were converting third downs at a 43% clip, and this Gator defense forced 15 turnovers. In their 5 losses, the Gators were giving up massive points, 36 points per game. Opponents throwing the ball almost 4 attempts less per game, but throwing for 279 yards per game. That's a 73 yard per game differential. The yards per attempt goes up almost 3 full yards. Actually, it does go up 3 full yards. 9.2 yards per attempt allowed, 13.9 yards per completion allowed. The rushing attempts go down by 2, but listen to this. The yards per game allowed goes up to 191 yards per game. So 59 yard per game difference there. The yards per rushing attempt goes up almost 2 full yards per rushing attempt there, 4.9 yards per rushing attempt. Their opponents, while converting less on third downs, their opponents in those losses, their opponents had a worse third down conversion percentage, only 38% on third downs, but the defense forced 7 turnovers in those 5 losses. So that's where the differential comes in at for me. And if I skipped over it, looks like I did. So let me go back and talk about their special teams, because the special teams was a major liability last year for the Gators. In the fact that, you know what, wouldn't say it was a liability. It wasn't just, yeah, let's change that, because I think instead of calling it a major liability, let's call it a major asset. Sometimes you just have to look back over the data and come to a different conclusion than what your notes said they were. So when I look at this Gator special teams unit, 13 for 16 in field goal conversion rate, so 81%, much better than the average. Made all their extra points. Almost 46 yards per punt. That was top 15 there. So we're going to change that to a absolute asset there for the Gators. So once again, sometimes you have to look at your data and just wonder if you missed something initially. So I would absolutely say we did, and glad that we were able to catch that before we absolutely went too far with it. So instead of a liability, Florida Gators special team was an absolute asset to their team last year. All right, let's get to the final grade here. The Florida Gators will get a grade of a C-. The reason for that, well, We like what we saw from this team in spurts, but as I mentioned, the offense was extremely inconsistent. The rush defense showed the ability to handle situations better, but when it came down to it, this team needed to not turn the ball over nearly as much as what we saw from them last year. So the final verdict for the Florida Gators in 2024, while they absolutely exceeded their preseason win expectation, this team had some unreliable games as far as the passing game goes, and the pass defense at times struggled against really quality offenses. This team had some bright spots in the run game. The defensive front showed some holes in also key situations. So let's get down to the three keys for the Florida Gators that they absolutely need to improve going into 2024. First key must be is DJ Lagway has to take the next step in becoming a better passer. We know that he's been limited in the spring, not being able to throw with a shoulder injury. Conflicting reports on did he have the surgery or did he not. We're going to go with he did not have the surgery, but it may be something that continues to linger as the season goes on, especially if he starts to take a lot of shots on that throwing shoulder. Could knock him out for a couple of games, could knock him out for the season. Key number 2, the Florida Gators, when they're right, they have a running back that can get in the dot and get yardage. Their leading rusher last year, Jaden Ball, 133 attempts, 675 yards, 5.1 yards per rushing attempt, and 7 touchdowns. When you think about some of the great Gator teams, whether it was under Urban Meyer or certainly under Steve Spurrier, this team absolutely had a running back that certainly could get well north of 1,000 yards in a season. So that's going to have to be something that the Gators absolutely figure out. The next key is they got to find a true number 1 wide receiver. Their leading wide receiver last year, 42 receptions, 783 yards, only 2 receiving touchdowns. You look at their next leading wide receiver in Elijah Badger, he had the team lead with 4 receiving touchdowns. That was on the season, folks. That's not in one game. I've seen some Florida Gator wide receivers that put up 4 receiving touchdowns in a game. So for your leading wide receiver to only have 4 on the season, that is a problem. And then the final key will be ready for the stretch run this year. You know, in conference, you're basically playing the same opponents. You're just flipping the home designation to away and vice versa. I think if the Florida Gators cannot get off to a hot start early on in the season, depending on how the schedule lays out, Florida could be in for a very challenging season in 2025. However, if this team improves in those key areas, the Florida Gators can get back to a bowl game in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at CrunchTimeSportsAdvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.